This story I want to tell you is not mine, but it happened to my best friend, and although she is now fine so to speak, many months had to pass before she could recover from the trauma she experienced. This is not the typical story of love and heartbreak, nor is it the horror story that everyone expects, because the only person who can attest to what she saw is Valeria, and to this day few believe her. It all began when Valeria began to suspect that her partner, Adrian, was being unfaithful to her. He, who was always attentive and affectionate, suddenly seemed cold and distant. He would disappear for entire nights without explanation, which inevitably caused Valeria to begin to have jealous outbursts that led her to really meet Adrian. Valeria met Adrian on a rainy day in July. While waiting for a taxi that seemed to never arrive, she had had a disastrous day at work. Her boss had scolded her unfairly, and to top it off, her umbrella had broken. It was a storm. That's when he appeared, elegant as if he had stepped out of a movie. He offered her his umbrella and a warm smile that seemed to disarm any bad moment. "I can't let someone so beautiful have her day ruined by a storm," he said in a tone that mixed gallantry and mystery. From that day on, Adrian and Valeria became inseparable. He seemed to know exactly how to make her feel special. Flowers for no apparent reason, dinners in exclusive restaurants, night walks where they talked about their dreams and fears. However, there were things that didn't quite fit. Adrian was extremely reserved about his past. When Valeria asked him about his family or childhood, he elegantly diverted the conversation. He would end up focusing on her and say, "Tell me about your dreams, Valeria. I'm more interested in your future than my past." In all that discreet and mature personality, there were details that aroused curiosity. For example, his impeccable and old-fashioned clothes, although he looked modern in his style. Valeria noticed that he was very strict in dressing. He said that he liked vintage fashion. Although it seemed contradictory, another thing that she noticed was strange were the absences. In cables there were days when Adrian disappeared without warning, saying that he had work matters. He did not use social networks and did not seem to have close friends or family, but not everything was bad. He also had things that Valeria and his friends, liked. Adrian had a great knowledge of many subjects. His cultural heritage was enormous, and he had such a peculiar way of telling things that it seemed as if he had been there to live them. When Adrian told something, everyone in the place listened to him as if hypnotized. It was to a certain extent pleasant to live with him. It was obvious that my friend was going to end up deeply in love with him. His gray eyes seemed to hypnotize her, and every time he looked at her, she felt a shiver running down her spine, that electric sensation that you feel only with one person in life. The relationship matured at the same pace as their passion grew. In a matter of a couple of months they were already living together. They loved each other madly, and it seemed that they could not be away from each other, except when Adrian's work issues came up, which was what made Valeria very upset, because deep down we all had the suspicion that someone like him had to be married, that maybe he had another family somewhere else. It was not normal for him to be single with all his points in his favor, or to appear for several days without saying where he was going. I have to admit that I participated in fostering Valeria's jealousy, and that could have a lot to do with her almost psychotic actions. That when she was dominated by jealousy, we thought that it was Valeria's actions and weakness that were affecting the relationship, because suddenly she began to act strange. She slept little, and it was because she had recurring nightmares with Adrian that made her wake up with fear, but also with many doubts. She compulsively watched him and had even asked him to install a GPS application on his phone. What began as a love story full of romance and passion began to become a story of jealousy, violence, and absence. Valeria began to notice his absence even when he was present. He could be having dinner together, but it was as if he were somewhere else, extremely lost in his thoughts. And then there were the disappearances, nocturnal escapades without explanations, and returns with vague excuses. One night, after one of his absences, Valeria decided to confront him. She had waited awake on the couch with the lights off. As the clock struck 1:47 a.m., she heard the door open, and if not, a mixture of rage and desperation. "Where were you?" Adrian, surprised, looked at her tiredly, as if carrying the weight of that question was too much. "I had things to do," Valeria answered without looking at her. "At this hour I'm not stupid. Adrian, tell me where the hell you were." The attention filled the room, and Adrian ran a hand through his dark hair as if searching for the right words. But all he said was, "It's not what you think. I'm not lying to you. When I told you that you were the person I had been looking for all my life, I meant it." The answer, far from calming her, turned her on even more. "That's what I think. There's another woman." Adrian looked at her then, and for a brief moment, his face revealed something that Valeria couldn't identify. Fear, but not towards her, but towards something that seemed to be out of her control. It's not that, Valeria, believe me, it has nothing to do with you. So tell me what's going on, what are you hiding from me? He fell silent and his lips pressed into a tense line, and finally, as if facing her questions were unbearable, he practically left the room without looking at her. That night marked a breaking point. Adrian's absences became more frequent, and when he was home, he seemed to fight something invisible. Valeria noticed how his hands trembled when he thought she wasn't looking or when he avoided any prolonged physical contact. His face, always serene, now showed traces of tiredness. Those eyes seemed to be sunken, as if he were losing an internal battle. There were times when he seemed to want to approach her, but he was always stopped as if he were afraid of what might happen. On one occasion, while he was in bed, Valeria tried to caress his face, but he abruptly pulled her hand away. "Don't touch me," he murmured in a tone that was more desperate than authoritative. Adrian closed his eyes and took a deep breath, as if he were fighting to control himself. "It's for your own good, Valeria, I don't want to hurt you." Adrian's changes weren't just emotional. There were things that Valeria would notice, even though she tried to rationalize things. This made her very high, and fear often found dark stains on his clothes that she attributed to accidents at work, but the persistent, metallic smell of these stains was hard to ignore. One night, while they were sleeping, Valeria noticed a deep cut on Adrian's arm. When she confronted him, he simply told her, "It's nothing, it will heal quickly," and sure enough, the next morning, the cut seemed healed, as if days had passed instead of hours. Adrian began to have fits of anger that he couldn't control. He would punch the wall or break things, but then he would apologize with a sincerity that confused her even more. One morning, Valeria heard noises in the kitchen. When she came downstairs, she found Adria leaning over the table, breathing unevenly. His shirt was soaked with something dark and there was a trail of dirt on the floor. When she touched him, he reacted with a violence he had never shown before. He turned sharply with bloodshot eyes. "Don't follow me," he shouted before running out to the vacant lot next to the house. For the first time, Valeria felt fear. Something was deeply wrong with Adrian, and although she loved him, she began to question whether his love was worth the price of her safety. Adrian's changes had brought Valeria to the brink of despair. The lack of answers and her partner's increasingly erratic behavior had pushed her to share her concerns with her closest circle. However, what she sought as comfort ended up isolating him even more. One afternoon, while talking to us, Valeria confessed through tears, "I feel like Adrian is hiding something from me. Something terrible." We tried to calm her down. "Maybe he's going through something he doesn't know how to share with you. You know how men are," but when Valeria insisted that he could be in serious trouble, we just looked at each other, a little fed up with his obsession. "Valeria, I think you're exaggerating. Talk to him, but don't obsess. Sometimes he imagines things that aren't there." Her parents didn't take her seriously either. When Valeria mentioned that something dark was going on with Adrian, her mother only told her that she had always been very emotional and that all of that was just it was a phase. These responses only intensified her frustration and isolation. Now she not only suspected Adrian, but she also felt that no one understood her. Valeria began to take action on her own without Adrian knowing. She began to check his phone when he was sleeping. She found no suspicious messages or calls, but she did find unknown numbers that were not saved in his contacts. She wrote some of them down to investigate later. She also began to follow his movements. If Adrian said he was going to work, Valeria followed him. A safe distance away, however, she never managed to see him and do anything strange, at least not until that night. It was just after midnight when Adrian left the house in a hurry, without giving any explanation. Valeria, who was constantly on alert, got up in bed and followed him in her car. She watched him drive through the city streets until he left the main road and took a secondary road. This led to a dirt road near the border with the neighboring state. During the trip, Valeria paid the lights of her car and kept a safe distance, trying not to be discovered. Finally, Adrian parked in an extremely remote area. There he was, on a dirt road illuminated by the moonlight. Valeria stopped her car several meters away and saw him open the trunk. With effort he took out what seemed to be a bundle wrapped in a dark tarp. Although the distance did not allow him to see clearly, the weight and shape of the bundle filled him with a terror that he could not explain. Adrian carried the bundle on his shoulder and entered the Valeria, with her heart beating at full speed, followed him on foot, taking care with each step so as not to make noise. After walking for several minutes, Valeria arrived at a clearing in the forest. There she saw Adrian digging a hole with a shovel he had brought with him. He left the bundle on the ground and continued digging with a ferocity that could only be described as desperation. Valeria, paralyzed, tried to process what she was seeing. Her worst suspicions were being confirmed. Her breathing became labored and without realizing it, she stepped on a dry branch that cracked under her foot. Adrian turned abruptly. With the shovel in his hand, his eyes illuminated by the dim moon were filled with a mixture of fury and pain. "What are you doing here? Did you follow me?" he shouted, advancing towards her. Valeria took a few steps back, trembling. "What are you doing, Adrian?" What is that?" she said, pointing at the bundle. Adrian sighed, dropping the shovel to the ground. His gaze, although intense, did not show the hatred she feared, but rather a deep sadness. "You shouldn't have come, Valeria. This is not something you can understand." She, terrified but determined, insisted, "Tell me the truth. Who are you burying? What have you done, Adrian?" Adrian was silent for a moment, looking at the crazy bundle. She finally answered him, "I'm doing it for you. From this moment on, everything I'm going to share with you is what Valeria told us while she was in the hospital. I can't assure you that everything is really as she told it, and maybe it's a defense mechanism to cover up the reality, which can be much more terrifying, but I'm going to tell it as it is. As I heard, you don't know what I'm capable of doing to protect you, Valeria, but now that you've seen this, nothing will ever be the same again," he told her with a face of disappointment and anger. Valeria, terrified, tried to get away, but Adrian didn't let her. "Promise me that you'll forget about this night. If you don't, you'll regret it." Not knowing what to do anymore, Valeria felt, but deep inside she knew she couldn't trust him anymore. Her mind was full of questions. What was Adrian really burying, and how dangerous was it to stay by his side? Valeria trembled, unable to process what she was seeing, and the shovel rested next to the hole. The lump was still there, and it was a disturbing shadow under the moonlight. Adrian sighed deeply, as if he were on the verge of a collapse, and he coupled it with his low voice, full of an emotion that she couldn't identify. "I didn't want you to find out this way, but I have no other choice. If you live with me, you're going to die, Valeria, and worse, you're going to suffer, Valeria." She stared at him with her eyes full of confusion and fear. "Adriel." She turned her back and confessed, "I'm not like the others, I'm not human, but I'm not like those vampires you've read about in books or movies either." Valeria's heart stopped for an instant. Vampires don't exist." Adrian slowly turned towards her. His dark eyes were shining with an unearthly intensity. "I walk under the sun and the moon, my blood runs through my veins, but I'm immortal, my body regenerates and I'm stronger, but I'm not fed by blood, Valeria. My addiction, my need is something else. Crying. I need the pain of others, their cries of despair, but what really consumes me are their tears, the salt, the taste of the purity of their suffering. That's something I can't describe to you. Every tear I taste brings me to a state of ecstasy, of animal abandonment." Valeria was paralyzed and wanted to run away, but her legs wouldn't respond. "And what do you do with your victims?" Adrian looked away with his remains full of guilt. "I make them cry, I break their spirit until they can't take it anymore. And then I taste them. It's a compulsion, something that transforms me into something worse than I already am." She took a step back, completely terrified, expecting the worst. "You were going to be one of my victims, but something changed. I fell in love with you, Valeria. I had never felt this in all my years of existence, but your sadness, your fear, your insecurity, I can already smell them, and I feel that feeling of anxiety to make you suffer, and it's unbearable. Every day I'm closer to losing control." Andrine began to walk towards Valeria. His hands were shaking. "That's why I've done all this, that's why I go out every night. And I do terrible things, it's the only way to stay away from you and not hurt you, but I can't go on like this anymore, it's not enough anymore." Valeria cried silently, but her tears weren't enough for him. His breathing became heavier and his gaze became predatory. "I can't control it, Valeria, and if this keeps up, I'm going to hurt you." She tried to run, but he easily reached for her hand. It worked around her arm while his eyes shone with a dark and terrifying desire. "I'm sorry," Adrian whispered before of picking up the shovel and hitting her with it. When Valeria woke up, she was alone in the forest clearing. The hole was covered and there was no sign of the Volto or Adrian. She got up with difficulty and, with the pain throbbing in her head, she ran back to her car. Panicked, that same night she danced about Adrian's disappearance, but the authorities found absolutely nothing. There was no trace of him or the activities she had witnessed. Worse still, when Valeria tried to find a record of Adrian, she discovered that he did not exist. There were no birth certificates, airline accounts, or any document confirming his existence. It was as if Adrian had never existed. The emptiness, the confusion began to consume her. Every day she felt her mind falling apart. The nights were a torment of memories and nightmares, and during the day people treated her as if she were crazy. No one believed her, not even her own parents. One afternoon, after weeks of living on the edge of madness, Valera suffered a nervous breakdown in the middle of the street. The screams, the crying were so loud that she was unable to stop him. So intense that she had to leave and take her to a psychiatric hospital. There, in the solitude of her room, Valeria wondered if everything she experienced with Adrian had been real or if her mind had created such a twisted story to justify that all this time she had been living with a serial killer, one who for some reason did not do with her what he did with his other victims. Several months had to pass before she wanted to talk to someone. Sometimes she couldn't because the medications always had her in a state of numbness. With what she described as a state in which she could not feel anything, neither sadness, nor pain, nor happiness. When she finally spoke, she told us all this. I know it may be hard to believe and that you think the same as many people, but she is my friend and I have to believe her. I am also worried about her because, on the recommendation of her doctor, the dosage of medication was drastically reduced, since she had shown an improvement in health, but this made her start to see Adrian's figure in various places. The medications led her to a state of not feeling anything and now she is feeling afraid again and she believes that in this way she is giving her attention again. I can do nothing but support her and closely follow her treatment, but believe me, when I heard the whole story I can't help but wonder if Adrian is a vampire in love and addicted to the suffering of others, or if he is a serial killer who really fell in love with someone other than his addiction to power, control and the suffering he exerts on his victims. That may be something I will never know.